If you haven't heard of Stephen King, then you've been living under a rock since the 1980s. He has authored more than 30 worldwide bestsellers, 34 of which have been turned into movies, from 1976's Carrie to 2017's It. Some of his most famous works are The Shining, The Stand, Salem's Lot, the Dark Tower series, and 11/22/63. He is such a prolific writer that he seems to publish more books a year than most people read. In the year 2000, Stephen King wrote a memoir called On Writing. In this book, he details the life events that shaped him as a person and writer. The book is also loaded with practical advice. I've read it 3 times over, and I've picked out 9 of my favorite writing tips for this video. Some of these tips get down to the mechanical tools of writing, and some of them are simple life advice for anyone looking to pursue writing as a career. Tip number 1. When starting out, the story and characters might not be what you think. Don't quit because it gets hard. You might have a clear vision of your characters and story when you sit down to start, only to find by the 3rd paragraph everything seems different. Hitting this point can feel like being dropped in the middle of the Amazon with no map, and writing can feel impossible. This doesn't mean the writing is bad or that you should stop. King wrote, "I had written 3 other novels before Carrie. Rage, The Long Walk, and The Running Man were later published. Rage is the most troubling of them. The Long Walk may be the best of them, but none of them taught me the things I learned from Carrie White. The most important is that the writer's original perception of a character or characters may be as erroneous as the reader's. Running a close second was the realization that stopping a piece of work just because it's hard, either emotionally or imaginatively, is a bad idea. Sometimes you have to go on when you don't feel like it, and sometimes you're doing good work when it feels like all you're managing is to shovel shit from a sitting position." Tip number 2. Drugs and alcohol won't help you write better. When I was in college, like many of my friends at the time, I idolized rock stars and drug-addled artists like Hunter S. Thompson and Philip K. Dick. When I started to get serious about writing, I'd hoped that drugs and alcohol would somehow boost my creativity. They didn't. Drugs and alcohol clouded my writing and snuffed out a lot of my creativity. Stephen King famously battled drug and alcohol addiction for a good chunk of his life, and many of his books like Misery are direct metaphors to drug addiction. But he debunks this myth that substance abuse and art go hand in hand. He writes, "The idea that creative endeavor and mind-altering substances are intertwined is one of the great pop culture myths of our time. The 4 20th century writers whose work is most responsible for it are probably Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Sherwood Anderson, and the poet Dylan Thomas. They are the writers who largely formed our vision of an existential English-speaking wasteland where people have been cut off from one another and live in an atmosphere of emotional strangulation and despair. These concepts are very familiar to most alcoholics. The common reaction to them is amusement. Substance-abusing writers are just substance abusers. Common garden-variety drunks and druggies, in other words. Any claims that the drugs and alcohol are necessary to dull a finer sensibility are just the usual self-serving bullshit. I've heard alcoholic snowplow drivers make the same claim, that they drink to still the demons. It doesn't matter if you're James Jones, John Cheever, or a stew bum snoozing in Penn Station. For an addict, the right to drink or drug of choice must be preserved at all cost. Hemingway and Fitzgerald didn't drink because they were creative, alienated, or morally weak. They drank because it's what alkies are wired up to do. Creative people probably do run a greater risk of alcoholism and addiction than those in some other jobs, but so what? We all look pretty much the same when we're puking in the gutter. Tip number 3. Put your desk in the corner. Artists often feel their work is more important than their responsibilities, family, or the immediate problems of life. They can become so hyper-focused on the pursuit of artistic perfection that everything else in their lives gets tabled as unimportant. This can result in a sort of obsession with art and neglect of actual living. King wrote, "It starts with this. Put your desk in the corner, and every time you sit down there to write, remind yourself why it isn't in the middle of the room. Life isn't a support system for art, it's the other way around." Part of art's purpose is to enrich life. If we sacrifice life for the sake of art and treat life as a sort of battery to power creativity, then we might miss out on the miracles that are happening around us all the time. So make sure when you sit down to write, put your desk in the corner. Don't put your life in the corner. Tip number 4, don't stress about vocabulary. Many writers feel their command of the English language is insufficient to tell the story they want to. According to King, writers shouldn't stress about their vocabulary. What you know is usually enough to get the story down. King says, put your vocabulary on the top shelf of your toolbox, and don't make any conscious effort to improve it. You'll be doing that as you read, of course, but that comes later. One of the really bad things you can do to your writing is to dress up the vocabulary, looking for long words because you're maybe a little bit ashamed of your short ones. This is like dressing up a household pet in evening clothes. The pet is embarrassed, and the person who committed this act of premeditated cuteness should be even more embarrassed. Later on, he says, you can happily pack what you have without the slightest bit of guilt and inferiority. As the whore said to the bashful sailor, it ain't how much you've got, honey, it's how you use it. Tip number 5 is fear is at the root of most bad writing. So starting out writing can be really scary. We might envision writing a bestseller only to find that our first few paragraphs fall flat. Fear of looking stupid or being misunderstood stop us dead in our tracks and can even stop us from trying at all. Overcoming self-doubt and fear is a vital part of becoming a good writer. Stephen King said, I'm convinced that fear is at the root of most bad writing. If one is writing for one's own pleasure, that fear may be mild. Timidity is the word I've used here. If, however, one is working under deadline, a school paper, a newspaper article, the SAT writing sample, that fear may be intense. Dumbo got airborne with the help of a magic feather. You may feel the urge to grasp a passive verb or one of those nasty adverbs for the same reason. Just remember before you do that Dumbo didn't need the feather. The magic was in him. Tip number 6. Discipline and work habits pave the road to success. To be a good writer, you have to work at it every day. No matter the circumstances, you have to force yourself to sit down and write daily. Stephen King has written so many books and writes at such a quality because he has an incredible work ethic. I like to get 10 pages a day, which amounts to 2,000 words. That's 180,000 words over a 3-month span. A goodish length for a book, something in which the reader can get happily lost, if the tale is done well and stays fresh. On some days, those 10 pages come easily. I'm up and out doing errands by 11:30 in the morning, perky as a rat and liverwurst. More frequently, as I grow older, I find myself eating lunch at my desk and finishing the day's work around 1:30 in the afternoon. Sometimes, when the words come hard, I'm still fiddling around at tea time. Either way is fine with me, but only under dire circumstances do I allow myself to shut down before I get my 2,000 words. So Stephen King writes a lot, and he's very disciplined about his craft. So he sits down to write every single day, and later on in the text, he gives you or us an assignment as aspiring authors. He says, by the time you step into your new writing space and close the door, you should have settled on a daily writing goal. As with physical exercise, it would be best to set this goal low at first to avoid discouragement. I'll suggest 1,000 words a day, and because I'm feeling magnanimous, I'll also suggest that you can take 1 day a week off, at least to begin with. Tip number 7, throw plot and outlines in the trash. Stephen King mainly writes situational stories. Unlike many other writers who meticulously plot and outline their stories before ever putting pen to paper, Stephen King does not do this. He says, in my view, stories and novels consist of 3 parts. Narration, which moves the story from point A to point B, and finally to point Z. Description, which creates a sensory reality for the reader. And dialogue, which brings characters to life through their speech. You may wonder where plot is in all this. The answer, my answer anyway, is nowhere. I won't try to convince you that I've never plotted any more than I try to convince you that I've never told a lie, but I do both as infrequently as possible. I distrust plot for 2 reasons. First, because our lives are largely plotless, even when you add in all our reasonable precautions and careful planning, and second, because I believe plotting and the spontaneity of real creation aren't compatible. It's best that I be as clear about this as I can. I want you to understand that my basic belief about the making of stories is that they pretty much make themselves. The job of the writer is to give them a place to grow, and to transcribe them, of course. If you can see things this way, or at least try to, we can work together comfortably. If, on the other hand, you decide I'm crazy, that's fine. You won't be the first. So when I first read this and I realized that Stephen King wasn't plotting or outlining anything, I kind of wondered to myself, well, how did he structure his stories and how did he come up with it? That leads us to tip number 8, which is don't ask about plot. Ask what if. Instead of plotting or outlining to really uncover the story, Stephen King advises that we search for the overriding what if question, which will help us open up the story. He gives real examples of what if questions which spawn some of his own work here. A strong enough situation renders the whole question of plot moot, which is fine with me. The most interesting situations can usually be expressed as a what if question. What if vampires invaded a small New England village, Salem's Lot? What if a policeman in a remote Nevada town went berserk and started killing everyone in sight? Desperation. What if a cleaning woman suspected of a murder she got away with her husband fell under suspicion for a murder she did not commit, her employer, Dolores Claiborne? What if a young mother and her son became trapped in their stalled car by a rabid dog, Cujo? These were all situations which occurred to me while showering, while driving, while taking my daily walk, in which I eventually turned into books. In no case were they plotted, not even to the extent of a single note jotted on a single piece of scrap paper. Although some of the stories, Dolores Claiborne for instance, are almost as complex as those you find in murder mysteries. Please remember, however, that there is a huge difference between story and plot. Story is honorable and trustworthy. Plot is shifty and best kept under house arrest. Tip number 9. Writing is about getting happy. Writing can be extremely lonely. It can also be devastating. My first novel took me a year to write. I sent it out to close to 100 literary agents, and I promptly received 100 rejections. I was completely crushed, and I quit writing for nearly 2 years. I wish I had those 2 years back. I'd gotten so absorbed in gaining recognition or making a career that I completely abandoned the pure joy that writing brought to my life. It's important to remember that writing is really about enriching your life and creating something. When things get tough, we need to remind ourselves why we started writing in the first place, so we keep at it and don't quit. Writing isn't about making money, getting famous, getting dates, getting laid, or making friends. In the end, it's about enriching the lives of those who will read your work, and enriching your own life as well. It's about getting up, getting well, and getting over. Getting happy, okay? Getting happy. Some of this book, perhaps too much, has been about how I learned to do it. Much of it has been about how you can do it better. The rest of it, and perhaps the best of it, is a permission slip. You can, you should, and if you're brave enough to start, you will. Writing is magic. As much the water of life as any other creative art. The water is free, so drink. Drink and be filled up.